Now, I see we've got some distinguished guests, and the chair will recognize the gentleman from Essex and Middlesex, Mr. Tarr, an honored minority leader, to recognize his distinguished guests.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and through you to the members and the guests. It's wonderful to have so many people here today in this chamber gathered with us that are such important guests. And Mr. President, one of the reasons for that is because today is a day that we recognize the importance of parliamentary rules. And one of the founders of those parliamentary rules, not only in Massachusetts, but also in the nation, that individual being George Demeter. Mr. President, George Demeter was the first person of Greek-American ancestry to be elected to the legislature here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and arguably he was the first in the nation to be elected to a state legislature. And Mr. President, in his work in the legislature, one of the tasks that he focused on was the idea of having parliamentary rules that would guide the process so that it was fair and inclusive and allowed for the proper consideration of ideas and the proper expression of those ideas by individual members of the legislature. And Mr. President, as a result of that good work, Chapter 208 of the Acts of 1989 reads that the governor shall annually issue a proclamation setting apart the second Wednesday in April, April being the month designated as National Parliamentary Month, as George Demeter Day, in honor of George Demeter's contributions to the parliamentary process and his dedication to the protection of the rights of individuals by ensuring an orderly process by which all organizations and deliberative bodies can make decisions. Now, Mr. President, the governor has in fact issued that proclamation, and I do hold it in my hands, and I'm not going to read it, but Mr. President, this is the proclamation that is required by the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now, Mr. President, in order to recognize this day and the importance of George Demeter to our Commonwealth and to our nation, we do have some special guests, and I would ask the staff and the members and our other guests to join me in recognizing them. The first one is the Consul General of Greece, Symeon Tegos, who is here, and we're very honored to have him. So, Consul General, thank you for being with us. In addition to that, we have Paul Sisopoulos, who is the president of the Alpha Omega Council, one of the preeminent organizations in Massachusetts. Peter Klapes is with us. He is the president of the George Demeter unit of the National Association of Parliamentarians. Thank you for being with us. And, Mr. President, we also are honored to have with us today some of George Demeter's family. They include Connie Prescott, who is George Demeter's niece. Let's give her a round of applause. Les Christos, who is George Demeter's grandnephew. And of course, past president of the Boston AHEPA, the Hellenic Bar Association, and the National Associations of Parliamentarians George Demeter Unit, Peter Sinopoulos. Peter, thank you. And I would point out that Peter, every year, is the architect of these celebrations and these commemorations, and when this presentation is concluded, in the reading room, he will be doing a presentation on the legacy of George Demeter and his importance in the history of this country. I also just want to take a moment to recognize Tina Papadopoulos, who is the president of the Maids of Athena. Tina, I know I saw you here somewhere. There you are. And, Mr. President, just a little bit more about George Demeter before I conclude. He came from Greece in 1904. He was a graduate of Boston Latin School, of Harvard. He was a World War I veteran, and he was the second Supreme President of AHEPA. He was the author of the nationally recognized Demeter's Manual of Parliamentary Law and Procedure, highly regarded by scholars of parliamentary law and procedure throughout the country. And as I mentioned, he was one of the first Americans of Greek descent to be elected to the legislature. And one thing, Mr. President, that as we are here on the eve of the Boston Marathon, I think that it's significant to note, is that it was none other than George Demeter who began the tradition of crowning winners of the Boston Marathon with an olive wreath. And Mr. President, he did that from 1933 to 1946. So, Mr. President, I am honored to be able to have these guests with us today and to welcome them to the Senate. We appreciate all of you being here. This is a body that very, very much values parliamentary law and procedure, and one that it is a tradition that we try to uphold in this Senate. And today we get to recognize one of the individuals who has given us that legacy. So I'd ask for one more round of applause for all of our visitors and guests today. And just briefly, if I could ask Peter and our Consul General to join me on the rostrum for just a moment. Just give him this.
All right, just continuing. Thank you so much. Honored to have these guests with us today and honored to have the occasion to recognize Mr. Demeter and his legacy.